you saw the movie Jerry Maguire, you might have thought about studying sport law or becoming a player's agent. Similarly, if you've been tracking some of the top athletes in the world's endorsement contracts that are worth millions and even billions of dollars, you might also want to study sport marketing. If you enjoy watching the Super Bowl advertisements more than the game itself, you might want to enter the exciting field of sport advertising. Sport finance can be more exciting than all these disciplines combined, however. Marketing, sponsorship, facility construction, sport law, and all other sport management disciplines cannot be undertaken without the knowledge of the financial position of the team, business, or organization. Thus, sport finance is a linchpin for all decisions and action in sport businesses. Students who think that sport accounting and finance are not as exciting as sport law, marketing, or advertising are simply wrong. Some of the most interesting jobs in sport focus on finance-related issues. For example, the National Football League and National Basketball Association teams normally have capologists who are directly responsible for ensuring that the team does not violate the salary cap for its players. Financial numbers can tell us many important facts about a business as well. So even though sport finance has never been considered an exciting component within any sport and fitness administration curriculum, it might be one of the most important topics that you study throughout your career. Thus, this lecture is designed to help you understand the numerous financial issues faced by any sport or fitness business, including college athletics as well. In our context of sport and the economy, we see that it's a big business, ranked in the neighborhood of 20th overall and bigger than the lumber and automobile industries combined. It involves athletes, teams, owners, coaches, event sponsors, advertisers, spectators, etc., and commercialism in sport usually highest in densely populated areas, which occurs around cities. Commercial sport is a luxury, and people have time, money, and freedom and discretionary income, more importantly, to spend on sport. Many major financial companies have collapsed, leaving millions of dollars of sponsorship money in jeopardy. Several automobile companies severely struggle and must cut their sponsorship dollars, most notably GM's decision to end their relationship with Tiger Woods, arguably the most marketable athlete there is, or there was, before his scandal, I should say. Some other issues in sport: the Houston Comets WNBA franchise folded because of financial trouble and a lack of interested buyers. The Arena Football League shut their doors for at least one season, possibly longer. Ticket sales are down across the board, almost every sport, including football, which has historically had the most consistent level of ticket sales of the Big Four. Leagues and teams have slashed their budgets, including staffing cuts ranging anywhere from 5 to 20%. This also includes NASCAR race teams, who are hit hard because of their dependence on sponsor dollars and the automobile industry. Some smaller sporting events, such as cycling, golf, and racing, have been scaled back or canceled entirely. While a few big league teams defy the economic logic of the times, take, for example, the New York Yankees committing $430 million to free agents this offseason, and they prepare to move, or they have moved, into their $1.5 billion brand new stadium. Franchises in all sport are weighing pricing and other options in an attempt to retain season ticket holders and attract new businesses. The Meadowlands Stadium is expected to cost $1.3 billion when it's all said and done. The 2012 London Olympics is expected to raise the GDP of the UK by $347 billion. Forbes just reported that new team values, the Cowboys ranking among the highest at $1.5 billion, Manchester United not far behind, followed by the Yankees, Knicks, Maple Leafs, and Roush and Fenway Racing topping the list. NCAA and CBS Sports extended their men's basketball tournament contract that is currently worth $6 billion. Some other key trends: we can see that sport tourism is valued at about $111 billion. Sports sponsorship expenditures exceed $13 billion. NASCAR brings in about $21 billion, including all of its sponsorship dollars combined. And the economic impact of the gay games in Atlanta was estimated at $350 million. So you can see sport finance encompasses not only smaller aspects of sport, but the larger sport business industry as well. When talking about the economic magnitude of the sport industry, it's sort of a gray area because there really is no sport industry per se. The sport industry is relegated to the North American Industrial Classification System, or the NAICS. Within this classification system, there are 20 sectors of major economic activity, and sport-related activities are scattered across almost 8 of the 20 sectors. So you can see that sport is pervasive over all aspects of business, or at least half of those businesses combined in the NAICS. Thus, there is no official sport industry according to the system. But as we said, sport is pervasive in many aspects of business, but the lack of a single aggregate figure provided by a government agency tends to leave a void that several analysts and sport business practitioners have yet to fill. Therefore, the use of assumptions skews the actual data in response to what it actually entails for the consumer. At the end of the 1990s, estimates of total spending related to sport ranged from $213 to $560 billion, quite a large disparity among researchers. However, the estimates provided by the Sport Business Journal, which is largely thought of as the most detailed financial publication, current financial publication in sport, provides a good starting point. It gives us 15 categories of sports spending valued at almost $300 billion. So we'll use that number throughout the course of this lecture. However, there are several items not included in their classification system. For example, cycling, aerobics, hunting, fishing, jogging, camping, and boating, largely thought of as recreational activities, still fall under the sport moniker. Sport consumer spending is what really drives these numbers, and sport consumer spending is predicated on what we refer to as discretionary income, or that income that you decide personally how to spend it. It's money left over after you pay your taxes, pay your bills, and pay all your other outstanding obligations. It's that discretionary dollars that people allocate to sport, and that's what we're trying to capture in the industry. A very recent ESPN poll, in fact about a couple of months ago, stated that 86% of Americans are sport fans. Sport interest has increased from 2001 to 2008 after 9/11, so in a post 9/11 era, people are more attracted to sport. Sport interest has declined since June 2008, however, with 67% of Americans saying that they have less spending money than last year, not surprisingly, and 40% say they have much less than last year, and 65% of Americans say they are not likely to spend money on sport because of the economy. 45% said they are very likely. So you can see, even in a down economy, people are still willing to spend their dollars on sport. So even though we mentioned that $300 billion was roughly the size of the sport industry that's classified by the Sport Business Journal, there are those other segments of the industry, such as cycling and aerobics, that weren't captured. So the actual size of the sport industry, we estimate, is about $410 billion, and that's according to Plunkett Research 2009. Annual company spending for sport advertising in the U.S. is about $30 billion as well. So comprising the largest chunk of the U.S. sport industry are the four major sport leagues listed on the slide above. The NFL at $6.2 billion, Major League Baseball at $6.0 billion, NBA $3.2 billion, and the NHL at roughly $2.4 billion. The top four major leagues each have revenues that can be many times greater than the payrolls of less popular major leagues in two nations. In terms of overall league revenues, the NFL, Major League Baseball, and NBA, in that particular order, rank as the three of the four most lucrative sport leagues in the entire world, with the Premier League of English Soccer being third or fourth place, depending on the exchange rates and calculations. Somewhat complicated compared to the U.S. system. So we'll place them third, and the NHL will rank fifth on that list. While the list on the slide above doesn't comprise all areas that U.S. consumer spending is relegated to, you can see some of the top or most priority given areas. For example, the internet, advertising, endorsements, facility construction, medical treatments, travel are all contributing to the overall or the aggregate value of the U.S. professional sport industry. While these numbers are a bit antiquated, they still give you an overall or general sense of the economic reality of Major League Sport. So according to the Sport Business Journal, net income has steadily declined across all leagues. 81% of Major League Baseball and 50% of NHL finished in red in 2001. Since 1993, Major League Baseball has lost money each year, usually between $200 and $300 million. And NFL profitability fell almost 30% over the last 3 seasons. And that's surprising given that the NFL is the most popular sport property in the U.S. and number one overall in the world. Within the sport industry, there are several revenue sources that we need to consider, and we'll talk through these at various lengths throughout the course of this lecture and other lectures in the class. So sport enterprise sources are comprised of ticket sales, concessions, PSLs, which are personal seat licenses, which we'll get to in a couple of weeks, including naming rights, luxury seating, licensed merchandise, and media fees. There's also 2 sources of revenues I want you to have: public sources and private sources of revenue. Under public sources, we list things like hard and soft taxes, grants, subsidies, tax abatements, and under private sector resources, we'll list things like investment capital, corporate sponsorships, donations, and bond sales to fund the sale or fund the financing of sport businesses. There are some keys to economic survival, however. Just because revenues are going down, consumer interest seems to be waning slightly because of the down economy, there are some ways in which these sport leagues remain viable. The primary mode is what's called revenue sharing. And first, I'm going to give you a real general, broad-based definition of revenue sharing, and then we'll go specific league by league and explain how they conduct their revenue sharing policies. Here's the definition. It's the splitting of operating profits and losses between the general partner and limited partners. But more generally, it's the practice of sharing operating profits with a company's employees or of sharing the revenues resulting between companies in an alliance. It's that last statement, the alliance portion, that really fits well with the four major sport leagues. For example, the NFL, which ranks probably among the first of all the four big sport leagues in terms of their revenue sharing policies. They split 60-40 home and away gate receipts for regular season and 50-50 for the playoffs. What's particular to note about the NFL, however, and this is really important to write down, is that the media rights and licensing, marketing, promotions, and publishing are all split evenly. So before the snap of the first football of any NFL season, CBS Sports and Fox Sports, with whom the NFL holds their primary rights with, divides up amongst their teams the entire value of the revenue that's shared from the media rights. So let's call it $500 million. That $500 million is split evenly for every team in the NFL. Now, presumably, that money is supposed to cover the team's salary cap, which it does in most cases. So imagine if you're a small or medium-sized organization, just like one of these NFL teams, and you have your payroll covered before the first day of the fiscal year of every season. Makes things a little bit easier for you, and that's exactly what the NFL does, and that's why they have been able to remain the most viable sport league in the United States and the world. National Basketball Association also ranks right up there with how they split revenues, their gate receipts. The home team, however, keeps 100% of the gate receipts. Those are not split. And the media and national telecast are all shared amongst the teams. So the only thing the NFL does differently is that they split the gate receipts 60-40, whereas the NBA retains full. The disparate league here is Major League Baseball. Why they split their gate receipts 80-20, home and away for American League, and 95-5 for home and away for National League. I'm not sure why the two leagues are different, but they are. So we'll just go with that. Licensed merchandise is all shared, and the media is only national telecasts are shared. However, Major League Baseball is alone among the major sport leagues in that it lacks any form of a salary cap and has enacted only modest forms of revenue sharing and luxury taxes. And compared to the other leagues, there is a far greater disparity between Major League Baseball payrolls. So in terms of league structure, this is the league that should adopt a more stringent revenue sharing policy. However, they have failed to do so in the past, and it's not likely that they will do so in the future. So let's shift gears a bit away from the four primary sport leagues, which arguably provide most of the revenue to the U.S. professional sport industry. But the fastest growing segment of the sport industry is what we refer to as alternative or action sports. For example, the X Games, the Gravity Games, the Dew Tour, Grind TV, asnews.net, or some of the premier sites or some of the premier properties that action sports offer. I'm personally a big fan of action sports. I think they provide great excitement to the viewer and also provide a lot of much needed revenue to small cities and smaller markets that can house these games. The lineage of alternative sports is as follows. In 1994, there was a press conference at Planet Hollywood in New York City, and on April 12th, ESPN announced that the first Extreme Games will be held in Rhode Island in June of 1995. Approximately 200,000 spectators attended the first games, and there were 7 sponsors on hand: Advil, Mountain Dew, Taco Bell, Chevy, AT&T, Nike, and Miller Lite. In 96, 2 years later, the event name changed to the Extreme Games and then officially changed to the X Games to apply to a more international audience. 1997, the inaugural Winter X Games were televised to 198 countries and territories in 21 different languages, and this is the first time that ABC Sports broadcasts an X Games event. More than 38,000 spectators made the trek to Big Bear Lake for 4 days of competition. 3 years later, in 2000, Winter X Games 4 were held in Mount Snow, Vermont. The first Winter X of the Millennium featured the largest crowds to date at about 90,000 people, and it debuted on the East and West Coast at the same time, and the new snowboard superpipe competition was added, which subsequently led to its inclusion in the Olympic Winter Games. In 2005, an announcement was made that the X Games will remain in Los Angeles through 2009. Since then, the venue has shifted. For the most part, these sports were shunned by the media and sport loyalists who refer to them as pseudo-sports. However, They've been associated with numerous sponsorship deals and opportunities to sort of inculcate their place in the major sport industry. Many companies see alternative sports are a viable conduit to reach some typically hard to penetrate youth markets, because the youth aren't the ones out buying. They don't typically have the money. They have some small revenues or some small dollars to spend, but they don't have the large dollars that it takes oftentimes to buy the equipment and buy the merchandise that's associated with these sports. We tend to see booms in these industries that are relatively small and up and coming in a relatively quick pace, and the same thing happened with X Games. Roughly 80 million young Americans between 12 and 24 spend billions of dollars annually on equipment and apparel. Well, mostly their parents spend the money, but we attribute it to the kids' interest. So inline skates, 251, snowboarding, skateboarding, and wakeboarding rounding out the list. I have compiled my favorite moments from the X Games, and you can view those at your leisure at the bottom, the Tony Hawk, Dave Mirra, and Travis Pastrana. However, the X Games have a list of their moments, such as Tony Hawk's 900, Shaun White's first gold medal, X Games Moto in 1999, Dave Mirra's double backflip, the mega ramp at the Staples Center, which we've probably seen in 2003, and then the double backflip in 2006. So enjoy those YouTube videos. Since we're talking about spending booms, we might as well shift gears back to the four major sport leagues. The 1990s saw an incredible spending boom from approximately 1995 to 2003. There was $16 billion invested in new stadium constructions, with almost 160 new facilities constructed during that time period. Sport team and league proliferation was among the norm at this time, and corporate investment really shot through the roof during this period of expansion. We're going to talk a little bit later about public and private modes of funding, but keep that in the back of your mind that this is how this whole process became viable. In terms of proliferation, there was 180 new sport teams with 13 new leagues, and the 80s and 90s saw enormous boom expansions in all leagues, including minor leagues and niche sports such as local hockey. Now, the numbers aren't that important throughout these lectures, but it's just to give you an idea of the magnitude of what we're talking about. Sponsorships, in terms of sponsorship deals, which is primarily the reason for the huge boom in construction, 5,000 companies in the U.S. spent almost $6 billion sponsoring sporting events and teams. The most common was a name-associated sponsorship, so the Dew Tour or something along those lines. Sports are still the largest category of sponsorship spending in North America, and in 2006, almost $9 billion was spent on sports sponsorships in the region, representing 2/3 of the $13.39 billion total. So you can see sports sponsorship eclipsed the next industry by almost double in terms of how much money is associated with sport. One, because of the huge viewership numbers and the on-site ability to advertise. Sports sponsorship spending in North America is said to increase to about $14 billion by 2011 and will continue to represent between 66 and 69% of overall sponsorship spending among any industry. Naming rights are also an issue that we're going to discuss later on in the term. 82 major league facilities currently are named by some corporate sponsor, and they have this idea of premium seating where corporations come in and buy large blocks of seats and give them out to their employees and potential clients, and we'll also discuss that later on in the term. Now, we're talking about the billions of dollars in sponsorships and ticket sales and novelties and concessions and merchandise. Any industry that has that much revenue is going to ultimately have problems. And the number one problem for sport in the immediate future is the economic condition or the state of the United States. Now, while we're rebounding and the markets have some steady increases in the past couple of weeks, months, and year, there are still some economic realities that we'll discuss later on that have hit sport hard, and nobody's really quite sure how that's going to affect them long term. Other things such as saturation, competition, declining ratings, or this economic disconnect idea are some other industry problems. For example, saturation. We call this an entertainment glut. So there's more sport than ever on TV and other media. Disney acquired ESPN and ABC, allowed for the increased expansion of television coverage among sport in particular. There's also competing markets with the television, the internet, the phenomenological rise of how we view sports online is going to change things dramatically in terms of cable TV. Companies in the entertainment business benefit from sponsorship and ownership in terms of exclusivity. For example, the Knicks own Cablevision, the New York Times, Red Sox subsidiary, the New York Sports Network, Walt Disney, Anaheim Angels, Liberty Media owns the Braves, Chicago Cubs were owned by the Chicago Tribune, and the Nuggets, Comsat Enterprises. Most of these organizers or these CEOs of these companies will say that they're in the entertainment business. They distribute entertainment, they package entertainment, they create entertainment, and what is more entertaining than a sport contest? In terms of ratings or the decline of ratings, the argument is that more people are watching, but more channels to watch. So there's more no-shows at the ballparks, more people that buy tickets that don't actually attend the games. So that limits the amount of impressions that sponsors can get from those people being there. Among the 4 major networks who have devoted an increased portion of programming to sport, fewer viewers than ever have turned out in the past couple of years. The NFL is down 25%, and that's the largest in all of sport. However, as a spectator sport, actually going to the games, it still ranks amongst the highest. In terms of this economic disconnect argument, and you can view the team marketing report, which is online. These figures are from 2008 because they tend to update every subsequent year. The NBA at $48.83 is up 3.6%. This was last year's numbers now, not this year's because they haven't come out yet. The NHL is about $48.72, up 8% from the year prior. Major League Baseball costs about $26, up 10% from the year prior, and the average price of an NFL ticket is up almost 8%, while the cost of an outing for a family of 4 has risen to almost as much as $75 for your family to attend one NFL game. It will roughly cost about $400. So the NFL is one league that has continued to raise their prices despite any other issues in general society. This idea of price magnitude is something that the NFL has sort of shunned and other leagues have embraced. So, for example, if it's an item you're going to buy as $1 and it goes up 50%, you probably still buy it at $1.50. But if the product is $10 and the same increase is 50%, then it's $15. So this idea of price magnitude is very critical. So in the NFL's case, when they have a $75 home ticket and they want to raise values 8 to 10%, well, now you're talking $80 plus the Ticketmaster fees. You're up to almost $100 a ticket. So there's a price threshold that has to be considered. And we'll talk about that in 2 weeks when we talk about ticket pricing and variable ticket options, things like that. There's also other factors to consider with the industry. There's the total cost because you have to park, you have to drive there, you have to get your family there, you have to feed them. So total costs have to be considered. There's also comfort. Some of these stadiums have gone to smaller seats to pack the people in, or some different options for seating. So there's a comfort issue. Also, many of these games are outside. It can be hot, it can be very cold, and that could dissuade some people from wanting to attend these contests. Certain player behavior on and off the field has really made this disconnect a viable issue in society, and also traffic and parking. Sometimes the lateness of the games and the fact that the games are televised makes it just as easy for you to stay home and watch them. While the previous slide noted some real problems and some real issues of sport, there are also some challenges, some things that are easy to overcome, but nevertheless still warrant consideration when you're talking through the financial aspects of business. For example, emerging technology, doing more with less, the valuation of sport teams and leagues, the various mergers of sport businesses, sport apparel companies, sponsorship, and stadium funding. For example, emerging technology, we've seen electronic tickets, internet viewing. They have the NASCAR in-car program, the virtual signage, which is really cool on the field, things like that. Doing more with less. Obviously, most sports, even professional sports, operate at a deficit, so they have to ensure that their scarce resources or cash is acquired and allocated in a way to yield optimum benefit. Sports organizations must be creative in their approach for this revenue generation, especially in a time like this where the economy is down. Doing more with less means absolutely a lot to them. The valuation of sport teams, there's numerous variables involved when you value a team and league. The most comprehensive valuation tool that we have as sport financiers is the Forbes report that comes out every year, and they take into consideration the stadium, the land the stadium is built on, how the ownership structured, winning percentages, all those different things factor into the value of teams. Kind of like when you're buying a house, you have a real estate agent that looks at comparables in the industry. They do a similar type of analysis. Very interesting how they do it. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Whether it's a new or existing franchise, the overall league financial strength, and that all factors into the valuation of the team. The mergers of sport businesses, we've seen a number of these in the past, and we're probably going to see a number of them in the future with the down economy. Sports Authority, Adidas Reebok merger, Fox Associates, ESPN, Disney merger, all of those are key financial mergers in the sport business industry. In terms of sport apparel, we know about shoes, we know about clothing, we know about endorsement contracts. That can affect the overall value of the league as well. Some of those key deals we've seen, Tiger Woods and Michelle Wie with Nike. We've seen Reebok go with Manny Ramirez and Donovan McNabb. Some of those big-time deals are the ones that we really focus on, and that sort of sets the benchmark for others coming behind them. We just mentioned sports sponsorship, but we're going to continue to mention that throughout the course of this and other lectures. There's heavy competition for the rights to sponsor games and events. Thus, there's considerable competition which have elevated the stakes, marked by long-term deals and huge contracts. And the long-term deals aspect is something that we need to consider. Also, what we consider probably the most contentious aspect or contentious challenge among sport financiers is the idea of stadium funding. It's also the most dynamic of sport finance over the last 20 to 30 years. Through 2001, 111 major league franchises were operating, with 92% of them moving into new or renovated stadiums. Most of these stadiums are funded through what we call debt service. They repay the money borrowed for construction, and there's a big push for new stadiums because new stadiums tend to bring in more revenue, and it's typically just easier for these organizations to build new than to revamp existing. We just talked through some of the challenges that professional sports face, which are numerous and far-reaching, and there's still going to be more in the future, but we just don't simply have the time to cover all those in this lecture today. We're going to shift gears here a little bit, intercollegiate athletics, and focus on some of the challenges they have, which are fairly similar to professional sport, but there are some really marked differences between the two, and we'll talk through those now. College athletics is considered a $4 to $5 billion business, so it definitely warrants inclusion in this discussion of challenges, problems, and overall magnitude of this aspect of the industry. The annual budgets for these schools range anywhere from $20 million up to $120 million. If you're the Ohio States, the Texases, and the University of Floridas of the world, you have no problem. However, about 70% of those schools still lose money, and we'll talk through exactly why that's the case in a second. Some of them just have state budgets they have to refill, or some of them actually do lose money, and we'll talk about those in just a second. However, there are about 16% of Division I and II schools that report more revenues than expenses. Each school is required to put out what they call an EADA report, and I'm going to have you look one of these up later in the term. EADA refers to the Equity in Athletics Disclosure Act, and what this means that all division schools, 1, 2, or 3, must put out a full detailed report of what they pay their coaches, how much money they bring in, how much money they put out, what each team is required to spend, what each team is allowed to spend. There's all those various aspects. If you have time, and I'll send you one in the future, University of Florida, it's very easy to find any schools. You can go in and actually see what every coach makes, what every team generates, and what every team spends. Most of these organizations or institutions couldn't operate on their own. Therefore, they rely on this idea of institutional support, which is university-supported dollars to the athletic department to fund their varsity sports, usually in the form of federal, state, or student fees. Stick to the idea of intercollegiate challenges for a second. The idea of Title IX is still a very immediate challenge for most of these schools. Now, the financial aspect aside, Title IX probably represents one of the top challenges for all of these schools to comply with. Now, the misrepresentation here is that most people think that Title IX is just a sport-only or a college sport-only amendment, which is not the case. It's an educational amendment that's supposed to encompass all aspects of higher education and higher learning in this country. Several key cases or key bullets here that I want you to have. First and foremost is Franklin versus Gwinnett Public Schools. It's really the first court case that brought this idea of discrimination to the foreground, and this assessed monetary penalties for all offenses. So that was the outcome of this case. The Office of Civil Rights, on the heels of the Franklin Gwinnett decision, maintained that discrimination on the basis of sex in athletic programs was a priority in their enforcement strategy going forward. And on the heels of that announcement, the Big Ten Council was among the first to step in and say, hey, we're going to allocate this proportionality test in terms of 60-40. We want 60% of the scholarships to go to men and 40% of the scholarships to go to women throughout the Big Ten. Since then, most of the conferences around the country have adopted this approach. Now, to comply with Title IX, there's a 3-part criteria test that the Office of Civil Rights has sort of outlined. The first is what's called a proportionality test, and that means that all varsity sport participation is based on the proportion of women in the student body within 5%. So for example, if there are 50% women on campus at any given institution, that means that varsity sport participation for women has to be between 55 and 45%. The second criteria test is that the university demonstrates a consistent history of expanding and improving women's sports programs. So they have to just move towards this idea of gender equity. The third criteria test is the university athletic department is fully meeting the needs and abilities of the female student athlete, which most universities are sort of moving toward that gendered position. However, the kicker with the three-part criteria test is that the organizations only need to meet 2 of the 3 criteria in order to be compliant with Title IX. So a big guess here, figure which ones they focus on. Well, obviously the proportionality is the hardest one to comply with. A lot of schools do it, but a lot of schools still don't. So they focus on 2 and 3. That means showing a history of expanding women's sports, so they could add 1 women's sport every couple of years and show that that's the case. And 3, that they're fully meeting the needs and abilities of the female student athlete. So they just provide them with all of the same necessities or all the same perks that the male student athletes get, and then they're compliant. Other ways to comply: they can secure additional money in order to fund those women's sports. They can redistribute the resources from men's to women's sports, which some have had to do, and they can also cut men's sports. So shifting gears back to professional sport for a second, with some more industry challenges, but specifically we're going to talk about now growth, globalization, and women's leagues. In terms of growth, it's very unprecedented during the 80s and 90s. We saw expansion teams in all leagues, but secondary minor league teams ranked among the highest in hockey and basketball. During this time period, basketball formed 4 leagues: the International Basketball League, the National Rookie League, the American Basketball Association, and the College Pro League. Now we have the NBA Developmental League, which basically took over the National Rookie and College Pro Leagues. Arena football during this time was the most successful. They only had 4 teams back in 1987, but to 2006 they had 19 teams, which 2007, 2008 seasons didn't run, but it's expected to be back up and running soon, because many separate smaller leagues have formed in smaller markets on the heels of the success of the Arena Football League. NASCAR was probably second most successful during the 1990s because they saw ticket sales increase by 91% and TV up almost 40%, and it was second only to the NFL during that time. Niche sports have also carved out their spot in the professional sport industry, but they have some challenges. Rodeo, billiards, and you can't go a niche sport without mentioning poker on TV. Whoever thought poker would be a televised sport is beyond me, but it's actually quite entertaining if anybody watches it. And they talk about bundling with other programming and how ESPN is funded on cable. So ESPN will typically bundle. They'll have like a Preakness Stakes, and they'll have a rodeo or a billiards match on bookends of those 2 events in order to capitalize on the high viewership that they might have. Poker is seen in mainstream. They even have poker tournaments on 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock at night during primetime viewing hours to show how this has really, really increased. The globalization issue is still on the foreground. NBA Europe, there's many foreign players in baseball and basketball, and this idea of cross-cultural marketing has been now embedded within the marketing and sport finance context. The only sport that really is not dominated in the U.S. is still soccer, although the Major League Soccer organization, since ESPN bought it, has been quite successful. And also women's leagues. The WNBA, the WUSA, which is soccer, and the LPGA Tour have been the 3 most successful, with the WNBA sort of topping the list as the most successful women's professional league in history. It's a 14-year run, 14 professional teams, so it's been quite a success story for the WNBA. All right, let's start to talk some dollars. When we talk about the economic value of sport, we'll talk about what the average team is worth first, and we'll talk about the leagues. As we mentioned at the outset, all the leagues combine for about $30 billion in peripheral and direct revenues. Major League Baseball tops the list, NFL football tops the list at $960 million per team. Major League Baseball, followed by NBA, and then the National Hockey League. The Boston Red Sox, Celtics, and Bruins are worth $1.45 billion combined, less than the Dallas Cowboys alone. New York Yankees are the only non-NFL franchise in the top 27 of team values. The Mets, Red Sox, and Dodgers are the only other Major League Baseball franchises in the top 40. In the NBA, the New York Knicks are the most valuable franchise, despite being horrendous for the last several seasons. This is direct proof that market size and hometown are key influences on financial success. The top four teams, the Knicks, Lakers, Bulls, and Pistons, are the four most storied winning franchises and thereby the most valuable. Baseball has the largest disparity from top to bottom, while the NFL, a league known for its parity, is pretty flat. So the least valuable team, the Atlanta Falcons, can still be competitive because of the salary cap and the revenue sharing generation that we talked about a few slides previous. The Toronto Maple Leafs are the most valuable franchise in the NHL, but rank 57th overall at $413 million. That's over 2 times the league average, despite not having won a Stanley Cup in a number of decades. The top 10 in terms of overall revenues or overall values are the Cowboys, the Redskins, the Yankees, the Patriots, Houston Texans, Philadelphia Eagles, Denver Broncos, Chicago Bears, New York Giants, Cleveland Browns. As I mentioned at the outset, Forbes provides probably the most comprehensive list of team values across the board, and they do all major sport leagues. But what's of keen interest to me is the NFL, and most of the students that take this course love to look at the NFL values because they are so high, and they really rank among the top 100 most valuable. All NFL teams are in the top 100, and only half of Major League Baseball are actually in the top 100. So it's pretty interesting to see how the NFL really comprises the bulk of the value of all these teams, and that comes from a bunch of different reasons, and we're going to talk about those later in the semester. But you can see the Dallas Cowboys, Redskins, Patriots, Giants, all those teams have large market areas. They have beautiful brand new stadiums, some of them, and they have really marketable players. So it really helps to solidify their position among the top in terms of team values. In terms of economic structure, you can see how revenues flow among the four major sport teams. In terms of gate receipts, media rights, stadium, and miscellaneous, you can see that Major League Baseball ranks pretty high, but the NFL is still highest in terms of media rights. The NBA is actually higher in terms of gate receipts than the previous two, but the NFL still accounts for the most in terms of gate receipts. More people go to NHL games than NBA and Major League Baseball games, plus there's more Major League Baseball games and NHL games than the other two sports as well. But you can also see the expenses are quite high amongst all three of these, or all four of these: player costs and general operating. Just use those numbers at your leisure. There are a lot of costs for these major league teams, but what ranks among the highest are player costs and operational expenses. So player salaries have increased almost 2.5 times in all major league sports over the past 10 years. There's certain control issues at play here. There's soft and there's hard salary caps. There's luxury taxes if teams go over these salary caps. And all sports except the Major League Baseball will change with the new collective bargaining agreements upcoming in 2011. There's problems too. It's exclusively labor problems because of these. There's resistance from these collective bargaining agreements, which allow both sides to come to the table. You have the owners on one side, the Players Association on the other side, and they all want the biggest chunk of the pie, but unfortunately they all can't have it. So that causes these problems, and it causes strikes, and it's happened in Major League Baseball and the NHL most recently. The National Hockey League, every sport league has endured at least one of these labor disputes in the last decade, the most prominent of which is probably the National Hockey League. They were the first North American sport to cancel an entire season due to those labor problems. The National Basketball Association's situation, when they struck a deal in 2005, it was just 2 weeks before the lockout would have potentially crippled the league and ended that entire season. The National Football League, currently, the players get 64% of all gross revenues, the highest in any of the four major sports, and the collective bargaining agreement set to expire next year is going to put an end to that. We may not have an NFL season in 2011. We'll see what happens with those bargaining arrangements. Major League Baseball, the 2002 deal addressed the issue of revenue disparity and competitive imbalance. Has done little to resolve it over the subsequent years. For example, the Yankees had a payroll of $208 million on opening day this past year. That puts them at $80 million over the luxury tax threshold. So they have to pay money on top of what they went over. I'll throw you a couple key terms and a couple key things to think about, particularly with regards to accounting. We're talking about all this money flying around, where it goes, where it comes from, how it flows through the organization. Accounting is primarily how you account for all those dollars. Accounting predominantly looks backward. As such, it's a historical record of the business transactions over a certain time period. Everybody would agree that most sport teams make a lot of money, or they bring in a lot of revenue. However, that's not not the case. Most of the owners show an operating deficit, especially in college sport and professional sports. The same, because most of the owners, they have other businesses too. They don't just run the team for their primary source of income, so they essentially want to show a loss after a year because it's a business expense. They get to write that off on their taxes and claim about 80% back on that loss. So the owners can increase their personal wealth at the same time submitting losses to the IRS for the team. They can pay themselves a huge salary, but show that the team lost money and recoup some of those dollars in lost tax revenues. Why would colleges want to show a budget deficit? Well, to answer that question is pretty simple. Most colleges rely on what we call institutional support from earlier, but also most colleges rely on state budgets that allocated from the state government every single year. Well, if you have a budget of $100 million and you only spend $90 million, guess what's going to happen? They're going to cut that budget back to $90 million so that you don't receive that $100 million that you couldn't spend. So you essentially want to spend over that $100 million to show that you not only need that $100 million, but you need more than that $100 million the next year. So hopefully that makes sense. So how do the owners and folks get away with this? Well, they have privately held organizations. All these dollars are not readily available, besides college athletics, to the average sports spectator. For example, you can't go in and find the New York Yankees accounting records for the past 10 years. It's a privately held organization. They're under no constraints by the federal government to report those revenues, so it's very, very difficult in terms of transparency to see what's going on behind closed doors. So this idea of creative accounting sort of evolved in the financial terminology. We already mentioned that owners receive salaries, so they're making more money than they actually appear to. These owners can also shift revenues among the entities. For example, the stadium, the team, different broadcast outlets, the luxury suites, which we'll talk about later. All those things can be shifted. You can sort of throw things under the rug or get creative with how you manipulate the numbers. Most of these organizations are relegated to what's called the Subchapter S criterion in the federal government. So these franchise losses are used as tax shelters for owners, and we'll talk exactly what a tax shelter entails, I think next week. The VEEK tax shelter convention is also an idea in Major League Baseball, which we'll talk about later. It's the idea of roster depreciation. So for example, when the owner buys a team, say for $200 million, it's alleged that half the value of that team is caught up in the players. So they can basically depreciate the value of that team over 5 years to the tune of about 20%. And that might not make sense to you now, but it will in a couple of weeks when we talk about exactly how that fits into the economic model of sport. So we know from the previous discussion that these teams gain in value, or their values go up over time. This is referred to as appreciation, and this is never more obvious in sport. Very seldom do teams lose their value over time, unless of course the viewership numbers languish to the point where nobody's coming to the ballpark. None of the teams are televised, and in particular Major League Baseball, this can happen. We saw that with the Montreal Expos. They had to move to Washington D.C., but in other four sport leagues this tends not to happen because of the revenue sharing policies that are existing in sport. So this idea of capital appreciation, it answers the question, how much money did I make and how much is it worth, or how much will it be worth in the future? So it records franchise sales, and have looked at increases over the past 30 years, and we've seen double-digit increases amongst most of the major leagues. For example, the major league rate of appreciation is about 19%. All NFL teams have shown more appreciation than Major League Baseball, but because of the hard salary cap, this limits the amount of money teams can pay for players, so they don't appreciate as fast because of the limiting factor of the salary cap. On the other hand, depreciation is the loss of value of an asset due to time and use. So everybody knows the old adage, you buy a car, you drive it off the lot, it's worth 15% of what it was worth 5 seconds ago. Well, the same is said in some sport properties too, especially Major League Baseball, where the use of it just kind of runs its course and depreciates over time. There are several benefits of ownership beyond just the appreciation and the depreciation aspect. Well, obviously, depreciation is not a benefit, but appreciation is. So what are some other benefits of ownership besides just the value of the team going up, besides George Steinbrenner seeing the Yankees rise 25% in team value over just 10 years in the 90s? Well, there's issues such as psychic income benefits, which we talk about. This is the prestige, the status, the fame, and the fun of owning this major league team. If you're the owner, you can bring in anybody you want to any game. You can wine them, you can dine them, you can have them sit around and watch playoff games and invite them to those kind of things. So there's several benefits, those sort of salubrious benefits, which we talk about. There's also tax sheltering benefits. So It's a business expense, you can cut your losses, and the return on investment over the long haul. You're going to sell the team eventually, you're going to turn it over to somebody, it's going to be worth more than it was when you bought it. It's just the nature of it. So that's the background information. Now we'll talk about what the current financial picture is for both professional and college sport. And these slides will be somewhat brief, but you'll get the idea as we move through. So the first two questions we've already answered. The sport industry comprised of not only the four major sport leagues, but all of the other areas that we discussed already: sponsorship, apparel, footwear, merchandising, concessions. All those different aspects comprise what the industry is made of. How much is it worth? Well, we already talked about those too. Those estimates are somewhat equivocal and relatively ambiguous in how they measure those things, but we know that about $30 billion for the four major sport leagues. We know X number of dollars for consumer discretionary spending, so just fill in the blanks there. The third bullet is what we really want to discuss. What's the future hold? Some current trends that we've seen in sport in the past couple of years are these. We know that the NFL is the biggest moneymaker in U.S. sport. We know that the NBA lacks revenue sharing. They've announced the NBA China, so that can potentially boost their global position, especially in the U.S. Or in the professional sport market. Canadian hockey teams soar in terms of cost thanks to the weak U.S. dollar and the declining U.S. dollar still. NASCAR has been able to weather rising costs by cutting team salary caps and cutting the amount of prize money that's given to the winning driver each week. Golf tournament sponsorships are going for big dollars. We know that the average purse on a PGA Tour victory is now $1 million. 10 years ago, it was almost half of that. Equipment manufacturers scramble to offer the latest high-tech advantages. Lacrosse is actually the fastest growing team sport in America. Sports agents have become indispensable despite the negativity they place on the industry. New platforms have revolutionized electronic games and the way we view sport contests. 3D is on the horizon. Bowling is the least expensive but the most drawing activity in all of sport. Athletic footwear, vast majority of shoes sold in the U.S. are now made in China. All these different things are what's going on with the sport industry and what it's going to allude to in the future. Also, as mentioned, traditional revenue sources are declining. Tax support, media revenues, gate receipts, and budget cuts are all adding to this idea, but at the same time, costs are escalating. Salaries are going up. Facilities are costing more to revamp, rebuild, and retrofit. Exposure is going up due to the entertainment glut that we've seen on TV, and basic costs are on the rise. Just because of inflation and general rising of costs over time, these things tend to happen. So how do we deal with these challenges, and how does sport face these head on? In terms of college athletics, the NCAA is comprised of public and private schools at multiple levels of competition, Division 1, 2, 3, and we have the FBS, the Football Bowl Subdivision, and that's a mouthful, but nevertheless, roughly 300 Division 1 or division institutions exist across the board, and these are structured mostly as self-reporting auxiliary enterprises, leaving them largely independent of academic governance and the process of the institution. Athletic programs increasingly must pay their own way through student fees, gate receipts, donation, sponsorship, and media rights. In a much broader picture, there are roughly 800 active members of the NCAA and 520 members of the NAIA. A great majority of these are heavily subsidized, which means it's just money given by the local governments or the state governments or the organization in which they're housed, such as the university, to provide them the opportunity or afford them the opportunity to be able to compete. Only a handful of schools break even in the operation of a multi-sport program, and again, that's largely because of meeting those state and operating budgets. A lot more of these schools make money than are actually printed to. However, we know the reason why. Even among the most prominent athletic programs, only one or two sports ever generate a net revenue or money left over after they pay all of their obligations. So the recent financial picture has seen sport program budgets quickly declining, as are institutional subsidies. Here's a couple examples why. So for the 119 universities that compete in the NCAA's top level, which is the Football Bowl Subdivision or the Division 1 if you encompass all sports, total revenues grew by 25% for the last 5 years, slightly faster than the 23% growth in expenses. So while revenues grew 25%, expenses also grew to 23%. But more importantly, the generated revenues category is where we really want to focus on. Those actually earned by athletics departments, excluding their institutional support. So this is the money that they actually earned minus what the institution gave them to be able to run their programs rose by 16% over the previous 2-year period. So in the 2008 fiscal year, only 19 of the 119 football bowl subdivision institutions had a positive net revenue, while the rest expenses exceeded their revenues. The median net loss for all of these programs last year was $7.265 million, but for the 16 programs that generated more than they spent, the average new revenue was $4.3 million. That $113 million difference suggests a widening gap between what we refer to as the haves and the have-nots in big-time college football, as the equivalent gap 2 years prior was only $11 million. So you can see the gap widening between the Texases, the Floridas, the Ohio States of the world, and the Fresno States and smaller schools that simply can't compete at those dollar levels. However, on the field, we've seen otherwise. Sort of recap again, we know 3/4 of college athletic programs lose money and are going to continue to lose money well into the future. And there's pressure, obviously, to cut costs, and it's felt at all levels of competition. There's major conflicts now happening over these student fees at smaller schools. All of you listening to this lecture pay student fees. You probably don't even know what you pay in student fees, but there's a certain number that's allocated to each credit hour that you get, and a portion of that money is sliced up between student government, between athletics, between all these other entities on campus that have their hand in the proverbial cookie jar that try to take some of that money. So there's a heavy conflict, especially at smaller schools that can't produce the revenue needed to cover all of their costs. There's really two major factors that cause these financial pressures. One is the idea of escalating tuition cost and gender equity. So to focus on the escalating tuition cost, for example, here's a couple of reasons. Now, there's major reasons for why universities decide to increase tuition. Some might decide just to bring the university up to the national median level. Some just generally need money. So there's a couple of issues here. One is all these institutions want to be listed on the U.S. News and World Report top public and private universities in the country. This ranking system carries enormous implications for how many students they can get and how many federal dollars they can get as a result of that ranking. However, to get that ranking, they need to do a lot of things. One is to maintain the commitment to improving quality as a top-tier research institution at Florida. We continually strive to do that here, so that's one of the main bullet points that we address every single year. Students must be in smaller classes where they are likely to learn and graduate on time. More faculty members need to be hired and more classrooms need to be built. This hiring of new faculty members results in not only more one-on-one attention for the students, but more availability of research dollars and dollars to bring into the university. There are NCAA rules that constrain the cost reduction options for the sport. So a lot of these organizations and a lot of these athletic departments are trying to cut costs, but the NCAA inhibits that in a couple of ways. They must sponsor at least 13 teams in 7 sports, with men's and women's combined, in order to maintain an NCAA institutional ranking, and they must spend a minimum of $500,000 on scholarships in all non-revenue sports. That means sports that aren't baseball, that aren't football, that aren't basketball. They must still spend $500,000 on all those sports in order to remain an NCAA viable institution. Non-revenue generates about 8%, but accounts for 28% of department costs. So these teams, like the equestrian team and the lacrosse team, they're only generating about 8% of the revenue for the organization, but about 30% of the costs go to them. So you can see there's a big disparity between how much you have to spend and how much you actually get back from spending. Some schools have even cut men's sports to reduce scholarship. The most prominent examples were on the West Coast, where some very powerful college baseball teams in the past had to be cut in order to make way for women's sports, and this is just the nature of it. This is what some schools had to do in order to meet these criteria and remain a viable NCAA supported institution. Some of these other proposed cost-cutting measures include reduction of scholarships and walk-on players. In baseball, it's very difficult. They only get about 12 scholarships a year, whereas football gets north of 60. Recruiting has generally been limited. The recruiting coach has generally been eliminated across the board. It's just something that the teams don't have the availability of and don't have the ability to pay that person. Ending off-campus scouting, so bringing students to campus can be very, very expensive. So they're relying on only film to be sent in for the recruiting purposes rather than just meet the student and talk to them. They end staying in local hotels the night before the game, just have the players stay in their own home. It cuts a lot of money for the organization, and they eliminate the off-season training table. So when the players aren't in season, they're not allowed to eat for free or at the university's cost. In professional sport, only one of every three professional teams in the four major leagues lost money in 2003. The reason 2003 is still up there is because this trend has actually continued up until 2010, and traditional revenue sources are no longer sufficient to cover rising operational costs. Therefore, the five categories or traditional categories of revenue are gate receipts, media revenues, advertising endorsements, stadium revenues, and there's a miscellaneous category. These are the traditional aspects of revenue generation, but there's more creative ways that teams are trying to capitalize within these five classifications in order to gain revenues, much needed revenues. If you look on the notes pane on the side of the slideshow, you'll see that admissions account for about 40%, TV and radio about 40%, advertising endorsement 10%, food and concessions 5%, and miscellaneous rounds out those numbers. In terms of professional sport, there's a competitive landscape or a competition amongst all leagues and teams for vie for that discretionary income that we talked about at the outset. There's four major bullets I want you to have when we talk about the competitive landscape: the demand, the attendance, the venues, and the sales and marketing. In terms of demand, this is driven by consumer income and corporate entertainment spending. The profitability here depends on a high fan attendance and a large TV audience, both of which are enhanced by marketing and competitive play. The better the team is, the more they can market, the more people come out, the more people watch. Large metropolitan areas have advantages in the population base and TV audience they can draw upon, and teams in smaller markets, along with less popular sports and minor league teams, can compete by building fan loyalty through local marketing promotions, and they can appeal to this idea of civic pride. The average annual revenue per worker across all sport teams is over $325,000. In terms of attendance, Major League Baseball has a total attendance greater than the other three leagues combined. Last year, 76 million, or about 31,000 fans per game, and this is directly attributed to 162 games being played in Major League Baseball versus only in the teens to football. The NFL averaged 68,000 fans per game, but only 17 million total attendance due to fewer games, obviously. Both the NBA and NHL averaged about 17,000 fans per game and 21 million in total attendance. Not bad. In terms of venues, for professional sport, they include stadiums and arenas, of which 70% are publicly owned, so they're owned by the larger communities in which they are housed. Public facilities may be operated by the team at about 45%, the municipality 35% operate them, or a facility management company, which comprises about 20% of the industry. Constructing new stadiums and arenas typically cost about $400 to $600 million. That's been the average. Of course, we've seen some stadiums in the past 2 years that have skewed those numbers significantly. Most NFL stadiums range from 60 to 90,000 seats. Major League Baseball and NHL stadiums range from 34,000 to 57,000 seats, and average NBA arenas vary from 16 to 22,000. Lastly, sales and marketing. Customers for professional sport teams are individual fans and corporations. So while they have multiple customers, the fan and the corporations are the two primary. They buy tickets for business entertainment or employee rewards or just for personal satisfaction. The typical fan is male. He ranges from 53% of fans for Major League Baseball to 60% for the NBA. Baseball fans tend to be older than fans for the other major sports. More than half of Major League Baseball TV viewers are over 50 years old, compared to just 40%. Compared to just 40% of NFL viewers. The current issues facing professional sport are numerous, but the 6 bullets above provide a really good overview of the primary ones. First and foremost is they need to create and utilize additional revenue streams. Find different ways to garner revenues, especially with the online, the burgeoning of online and internet portals. It's very easy to communicate with fans and very easy to communicate games and the happenings with the team. So that's an additional revenue stream that's potentially viable. Revenue sharing has to happen between all leagues and teams. Major League Baseball needs to step up and change their policies, I think, because there's a complete market imbalance between some of the teams in Major League Baseball and of course, in NFL football. There's a large parity among the teams. Player issues are continually rising, especially off the field instances, which really put a bad taste in a lot of consumers' mouths when they're paying these people $100 million to play and they can't even conduct business off the field in a manner that's appropriate with that sort of salary range. Media rights need to be talked about as well in terms of national versus local. National blackouts in terms of local blackouts in terms of national coverage is continually an issue, especially with NFL markets. Expansion's going to continue to happen, and obviously there's many others here as well in terms of agents, overexposure of teams, leagues, and players, the dilution of the core product as we add more teams, as we add more leagues, as we add smaller niche sports. It just spreads the consumer base way too thin. Alienation of fans, the rising cost to attend a game, those kind of issues can push fans sort of to the periphery of fanship, and contractors, etc., and stadium financing. All those things are really contentious aspect or current issues that you as sport managers need to think about and start to address. All right, last slide. Moving forward here, what do we really need to focus on? Well, resources for pro and college sport. What are the resources? Where do they get them from, and how do they best utilize them? Well, they generate them directly from enterprises and businesses. This has been one of the most viable portals for sport revenue generation in the past, looking at the large corporation and asking how they can help, what they can do, and what we can give back to them. Resources from other external sources. This could be in governments, this could be in foreign markets, this could be in overseas markets. A lot of different areas here that can potentially be captured. Investor resources in terms of bonds, financing to build stadiums, to construct them locally and nationally need to be done. And there's also various public sector resources available too, like free land or tax waivers and abatements. All those things need to be considered.